Well, yeah, thank you very much. Good morning. Thanks for having me. I just arrived yesterday. There was like 25 degrees difference in temperature from Scotland. So I'm Rastko Sknepnek. I'm at the University of Dundee, which is even more north from Edinburgh, pretty much the end of the world. So I'm going to tell you today about the Vertex model, right? So this is going to be a very coding-based talk. So I'm going to go into the nitty-gritty details of what the Vertex model is and how to implement it, with a lot of discussion about the modern software design techniques, which I like to employ. This is all work in progress, so I'm a physicist, I'm not a computer scientist, I just have a passion for computer science. So everything I say is open to criticism, constructive criticism, so if you have ideas how to do things better, you're more than welcome to share them with me. So I'm gonna briefly, maybe like 10-15 minutes, talk about the biology of epithelia. And I encourage you to interrupt me to kind of make this a discussion, but probably not in the first part, because this is a very big overview, very broad overview. I'm not a biologist. I don't know, are there any biologists in the room? Nope. Okay, sort of, yes. So I'm a physicist in a biology department, right? So I think 10 more years to become a biologist. But then I'm going to move to the kind of more technical details. Then I'm going to talk about the Vertex model, explain you a little bit about the physics of the Vertex model, what the Vertex model is, and how it's applied to epithelial tissues. Then I'm going to talk about implementation. So that's going to be a lot of coding examples and how to organize things, kind of discuss about how things are internally organized. And I will briefly, at the end, conclude by talking about how to set up simulation and how to actually, what's the workflow of a simulation. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we are going to have a tutorial in 2 days' time when you'll be essentially asked to kind of run some simulations and do the kind of little bit of coding of the Vertex model in Python. So just a quick raise of show of hands. How many of you are proficient in Python? Okay, how many proficient in C++? Okay, good, thanks. So there will be a lot of C++ in here. Okay, so what are epithelia? Epithelia so there are 4 types of tissues in your body, right, broadly speaking. So there is epithelial tissues, muscular tissues, connective tissues, and neural tissues. So epithelia is one of the four biggest groups of tissues. Epithelia cover your body like skin. They also line internal cavities of all the organs. They are also lining passageways. They form glands for different secretion and so on, right? So they have multiple roles. They protect, skin protects you, right? Absorption of nutrients in your gut, secretion, so for example, sweating, right? And sensation, like taste, the touch, right? They're closely packed. They form barriers, so that these cells are closely packed to each other. Cells are polarized, right? So there is a distinction between the top of the cell, apical side, and the basal side of a cell. Right? They are typically attached to some kind of a basement membrane, to some kind of connective tissue, right? And they are avascular, right? So there is no vascularization going into the epithelia. That's why if you scratch your skin, it doesn't bleed, meaning you need to go deeper. But they are innervated, right? So they are nerve endings, so you can actually feel touch. Okay, they come in all shapes of form. So for example, they are simple epithelia, which are made of a single cell layer, and there are multi-layer epithelia. This is skin, for example. They can be squamous. These are these flat guys. They can be cuboidal. These are these guys in here. They could be columnar, and all of this can be in multiple shapes. And then depending on which organ you are in, you have a different type of cell. They regulate, as I said, they prevent you from, they regulate what comes into the body. That's very important, right? And they're important for sensation. They are also important, meaning they are also prone to diseases. So if you damage epithelium, you can get the inflammation. So you end up, for example, with ulcers. Most of cancers are carcinomas. So very often people confuse the two and equate cancer with carcinoma. Actually, carcinoma is a cancer which originated in an epithelium. Something like 80% of all the cancers are carcinomas. They start in epithelia, which is really not surprising because epithelials are barriers. Since they're barriers, they're exposed to the outside environment, so they need to kind of constantly have a constant turnover. They constantly need to regenerate, right? So if you have a constant regeneration, and things can go wrong, right? And epithelia are obviously involved in wound healing. If you cut yourself, it heals, right? So they're also very regenerative. So they are actually very, very interesting systems. Very briefly about how epithelial cells look like. These are all sketches, right? So as I said, there is a clear polarity between the basal side, which is a side which is facing some kind of connective tissue, and the apical side, which is the top side, which is usually placing something like lumen inside of your gut. A lot of things are going on inside. So a typical epithelial cell is, let's say, 5 to 10 microns across, vertically and horizontally, roughly. And then a lot of things going on at the junctions between these cells. So if you go from the top to bottom, you have something called the tight junctions. These are the junctions that make sure that you don't leak, right? That they're tight together. Then you have something called adherence junction. These are the junctions where actomyosin cytoskeleton is connected. So this is very important for spore transmission. Then you have something called desmosomes, which I have no clue what it does. It does have to do with the intermediate filaments. And then on the bottom, you have a bunch of basal junctions that actually allow cell to connect to the substrate, right? So these are highly complicated objects. And of course, you have nucleus and all sorts of other stuff going on. Now, biology of cell biology of epithelia is incredibly interesting and complicated, but that's not why we are. But at least I'm interested in. I'm interested here to kind of trying to understand mechanics of these objects, and that's what most of this talk is going to be about. Okay, so let me show you a few examples. Right, what I'm showing you up here is a in vivo imaging done in the lab of my colleague Sver in DMD. So this is light sheet microscopy of a chicken embryo. Right? So this is a chicken to be. So the movie, which I'm going to show you in a second, starts after the leg is after the egg is laid, which is, I would say, of the order of 16 to 20 hours post fertilization. Fertilization happens inside of oviducts of a hen, right? And when the egg is laid, the embryo is roughly 3 to 4 millimeters across, living on the top of the yolk. You can see it as a white spot. You cannot normally see it in the eggs that you buy in supermarkets because these are not fertilized. But if you get a fertilized egg, you would see something like this. And then the movie is gonna run. The movie is gonna run for something like 20 hours, 24 hours. So images are taken every 3 minutes, and it's gonna show you a development of what is called the primitive streak, which is the gastrulation event. If you read the developmental biology books, they're going to tell you that this is the most important event in your life, right? So that's the event where the embryo goes from 2-dimensional structure to 3-dimensional structure, where you start forming differentiation between the 3 layers, ectoderm, endoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm, which then actually develop into the other organs later on in development, right? So back here is something called the sickle region, which you cannot see, is the region of the precursors of the cells that are going to call what is called EMT, epithelial to mesenchymal transition, and that are going to be responsible for generation of creation of the internal organs later on. These cells are going to start contracting in this direction and start moving this way, forming a bright invagination in here, which is called the primitive streak. So let's actually play the movie. As I said, this is in vivo imaging. Please ignore the squares. Squares are to show, so that case can show people how amazing this resolution of these images is, right? So this is in vivo. This is really fabulous movie. You see a lot of things are going on, and you see this bright spot in here. Eventually, this is called the Hansel node. This is where the brain is going to be, and then somites, the spine is going to start creating this way. So the entire structure is maybe like 1 millimeter long. Down here, what we see are so-called MDCK cells. So these are cells derived from a kidney cells of a dog, right? So this is done by Chavitre-Pa. These are grown on a substrate, right? So these cells are living on a substrate. These cells, and here what's important, what I forgot to mention, is that these cells are not living on a substrate. These guys are not supported. They are just attached to the vitelline membrane. Vitelline membrane is the membrane which keeps the yolk in shape, right? These guys are not supported. This is supported. If you're interested in the difference and why is it important, talk to Jan in there, who is going to tell you everything about it. So if you place these cells on a substrate, they also grow and move. They propagate. And these are osteosarcoma cells, which were done in the lab of my colleague Inke Netke in Dundee with our former PhD student. So the bottom line is why I'm showing these movies is that if you put epithelial cells in a collective and if you put an epithelial tissue, this is a tissue or epithelial monolayer, right? Biologists like to make a distinction. Then these things are very active. They move on their own, right? And do all sorts of interesting stuff. And that's what we want to do is we want to understand how they do it, how they move, how they propagate, right? Okay, good. So how do we model this? Well, there are many ways of modeling this, right? There are continuum approaches, phase field approaches, and then Julia can tell you everything about, for example, phase field approaches, how to model these things. Where I like to sit is using so-called vertex models. So this is an artistic rendering of a columnar single layer epithelium, where the artist highlighted only the tight junctions, the top area, the apical side of the epithelium. So if you are interested in, so if you look from the top, right, this is a zebrafish embryo taken by Eva Maria Scholz some 10 or so years ago, right? So this looks like a tiling, right? It looks like a tile of your bathroom, provided that the person who made it for you was not completely sane, right? So essentially, just kind of random polygonal tiling of the plane. That's how the epithelium looks like. And if you are actually interested in kind of collective behavior, you pretty much don't worry too much about what's going underneath. That's really an interesting question, what's going underneath. So if you want to model it in 3D, again, Jan is the person to talk to about these things. But let's assume that I can actually approximate what's going on only by looking at the apical or the top side of the embryo. Then the entire thing, as I said, looks like a tiling, so I can approximate it as one, right? And I get to what is called the vertex model, right? So my cells become polygons. 2 polygons share an edge, and 3 or more edges move at the vertex, meet at the vertex. And the vertex is the degree of freedom in this system. So you're going to say, well, this looks a lot like a foam. Yes, indeed, this looks like a dry foam. Right? And that's where the vertex models are originally coming from. So the original work on the vertex models was done in the early 80s by Japanese groups, Honda and Yugichi, right? And it was kind of safely forgotten and sort of reinvented in the Western world some 20 years later. Right? That's an interesting story. What is the major approximation in here is that we are approximating cell junction as a single line. In reality, this is not how it looks like. In reality, it looks like, go back. It looks like this, right? So each cell has its own membrane, and then these membranes are connected to each other through all sorts of interesting proteins. So interesting stuff is going on at the junction, right? So in reality, cells can slide past each other, but we are essentially squinting a little bit and assuming that's not the case in here. So we are going to assume that the junction is a straight line. We are also not going to allow for junction to be curved. One can also allow for junction to wiggle. So Lisa Manning has done some interesting work in that direction early on, right? But the idea, the approximation in here is that we are assuming that cells are glued together, right? And that the junction between them is straight. And once when we do this, we can assign the area perimeter, native area, number of constants, lengths to the junctions, and so on, and build an energy functional which looks something like this. Oops. Yep.
So why do you call it the native area?
The native area could be actually reference area or preferred area or so what I mean in here by native area is, well, okay, so let me just go into this, right? So the cells, epithelial cells more or less preserve volume, right? So if I have something which is two-dimensional, which is three-dimensional, and project it into two-dimension, I can then refer to the conservation of volume as effectively the kind of penalty of changing area. And then if I take an unstressed cell as is and project it, then I can say that its projected area is the what I call native area or the reference area. Right? That's what I mean by, so some kind of, so what I'm doing in here, I'm essentially just doing a quadratic expansion about some reference state, right? So it's like a spring constant of an area, right? That's all. Yeah, rest length, right? Rest area. Any other questions? Okay, so you write something like this, right? So you have a penalty of changing area, which I just explained, because the cells are keeping their volume fixed, right? So if you are having something which has a volume fixed, you can change its area by changing its, you have to kind of change the height to change its area. So with a little bit of thinking, you can come up that the leading order term is going to be the penalty of changing the area with respect to some kind of native of reference area with some kind of prefactor, which I'm calling area stiffness, right? And then I'm going to have a penalty of changing the perimeter of the cell, which has to do with all of these junctions that are sitting on the top. Actually, those are a little bit lower, the adherence junction, which essentially form a tight ring around the cell, which kind of want to contract it, right? And then I'm going to model the penalty of changing the length, the kind of line tension between the two cells, right? So I'm going to have pictorially a system, a free energy or the energy, mechanical energy that looks something like this. So if I specify now the native areas and all of these parameters, right, I can now minimize this energy with respect to the position of the vertices to get the configuration of the cell. And as I said briefly about the history, so this all dates back to 1980s when it was originally introduced. But if you look into these original papers, the imaging of epithelia was really, really poor. And also printouts which you could make back in the 80s in the papers is also really poor, so you don't really see anything. And this was sort of reinvented by Frank Ulicher's group in 2007 or so. And this paper is now kind of standardly cited as the Vertex model paper, although the model has a much longer history than that. Right. Okay, so we have an energy. So we have now assigned an energy to the cell configuration, and the thing is now we need to play with this. We need to use this to do some interesting physics. Before I go into that, I'm going to mention that if you assume that all of these are constants that don't depend on C, don't depend on the actual cell. I should have mentioned the C in here means the sum over all the cells, right? So if I assume that these guys don't depend on the cell, I can actually take them in front of these sums. If I also assume that all of these lambdas, all of these junctional tensions do not depend on the actual junction, but are constant for the entire tissue, then I can take them around and I can rearrange my mathematics a little bit. In the lecture notes, which I've shared, you shared the, right? You shared the, in the lecture notes, I do this calculation, right? And one can rewrite the model in this form, in kind of symmetric form, where it's the sum of the penalty of changing the area and sum of the penalty of changing perimeter with respect to some kind of reference or native perimeter P naught, right? So I have a symmetric form. And one can actually introduce... Didn't I? Oh, apologies. Yeah, okay, sorry. There is the link which I sent on the link which I sent on the GitHub actually contains the lecture notes, right? There is a PDF there, right? But I can share the lecture notes also. Yeah, they were not proofread by then. Okay, thanks. Yeah. Okay. So one can actually construct a dimensionless ratio of the preferred perimeter P naught and the square root of the preferred area or the native area. And Max B, who was then a postdoc with Lisa Manning and also working with Jan Schwartz in Syracuse, recognized something very interesting. Right? And that's that if you tune this parameter P naught, so essentially the ratio of how much perimeter you have with respect to how much area you have at your disposal, you encounter a rigidity phase transition. So if you hit a point of roughly 3.81 for this ratio, which is exactly the ratio of the perimeter of a perfect pentagon to the square root of the area of the perfect pentagon, the barrier for the cell neighbor exchanges goes to 0. Right? So the system becomes floppy. So you can actually move cells through your tissue without paying any energy penalty, right? So the tissue becomes fluid. Now, of course, there is no dynamics in here yet, so I need to kick it somehow in order to make it fluid, and that's what Max did using the ideas of the physics of active matter. So in here, I'm showing you a simulation which Max did below this P naught threshold. So what he did, he gave a little bit of activity. So he assigned a cell propulsion to the center of each cell, and let them kind of noisily push around. And if you are below this threshold, everything kind of jiggles in place, but nothing moves. So you are in an extremely crowded concert, and all you can do is you can jump in place, but you better not try to go to the toilet, right? Because that's going to require quite a bit of energy activation barrier. Right? In here, if you increase P naught above the critical value, exactly the same idea, you put the activity, cell propulsion activity to the center of the cell, and you let them go around. But now cells have a lot of extra perimeter, which allows them to kind of change their shape, right? So they can squeeze around. You see that they actually start moving around. And one can actually calculate the mean square displacements and things like that and see that this is truly diffusive behavior, that they're actually moving. And it's all driven by this single dimensionless parameter, which is really very, very interesting. Yeah. So what Max did is essentially, as I said, he just wrote the equation of motion where he had assigned this additional self-propulsion to each center of the cell. And the equation is the first order because the cells are typically moving of the order of, let's say, 10 microns a minute or so. So it's very, very slow. So it's extremely low Reynolds number. So inertia is completely negligible. So everything you do in here is in overdamped limit. So you actually have a force balance between the frictional forces and the mechanical forces, and then you augment it by activity. Again, something you can talk to Jan about if you're interested in how to model friction in these types of systems. Okay, good. So a little bit about the Vertex model. This is the work which we've done with Andrei Koshmerl in Princeton. To our great surprise, nobody has done a linear rheology of these systems. I was expecting something which was done in 1980s, right? But no, not really. So we have actually worked out the linear rheology of these things, doing a very simple numerical experiment where you just tilt the box and see what happens. And without going into much details, you can actually in the solid phase, you see that the system overall behaves as an SLS and a standard linear solid. So a Maxwell element in parallel with the spring. It's not really surprising because the system is elastic, right? The system is viscoelastic solid, right? It's solid, and in the liquid phase, the system is viscous fluid, right? Viscoelastic fluid. So you can actually model the response as what is called the Burgers model, which are two Maxwell elements in parallel. And now we have a much better understanding of how this works. That's done in this second paper in here in 2023, if you're interested in how to do the normal mode analysis, right? If anybody's interested. Okay, good. But nonlinear rheology of these systems is really.
So, Rastko,
Yep.
question. So what is surprising to me, at least,
Mm-hmm.
is that this number that you find for the threshold is not the same number that was found for the rigidity transition. So you mentioned there 3.70. And the other one was 3.8.
Well, so 3.72 is for the perfect hexagonal lattice, right? 3.81 is for a random tiling. So this what Max did in here. This is a random tiling, right? So that's the 3.81 in here, right? 3.812.
In your case?
Which my case?
Next slide.
In the next slide, for the hexagonal lattice, meaning this one is that we've done both, right? We've done both hexagonal and non-hexagonal, right? And for the hexagonal lattice, you do it below 3.72 and above 3.72, and for the random tilings, you do it above. Okay.
So this value, is it for vanishing activity, or how does it depend on?
It's for vanishing activity. So that's actually there is a phase diagram in Max's original paper. So it goes down as you increase activity, right? As to be expected. But to go back, meaning we have some, meaning Yari and I had these long discussions over there. I'm putting you on the spot here. I'm sorry. So we have some disagreements. So Max claims it's 3.81. We claim it's a little bit above. Matthias Merkel agrees with us, so we claim it's more like 3.9 or thereabout. I would argue that it has to be the right number, that it has to be the fixed number, right?
Because, I mean, everyone, including us, claimed it was a rigidity transition without proving that it was a rigidity transition. The only quantity that you look at, or at least the most important quantity, is the probability of T1 transition.
Yeah.
And I mean, of course, this is a way to say that this is liquid or solid, but no one really proved the elastic modular in detail. So I would be very interested in understanding if this threshold is actually the same as the. It's not obvious.
I agree with you, and I think this is something which needs to be sorted out. And I think we personally went more into the biological side of these things, trying to understand the embryo, right? But I think there is some very, very interesting soft metaphysics to be told about the Vertex, the Vertex model itself, right? Which I'm not an expert in.
And also, in which way this transition happen when you increase your P0 term? It's happen a transition between solid and liquid. For example, for nucleation, you start in some points to.
This is something which I should probably refer you to the original papers of Max B. This is not really of this 2016-2015 paper of Max B. This is really not my expertise, right? Meaning he got all the scaling. Meaning it looks like second order, right? But I'm not gonna go into it because maybe Jan, are you familiar with the whole
scaling story? Not well enough.
Not well enough, yeah. So we can, I apologize, meaning we can look into this, right?
But no.
Okay, so and then Max did the nonlinear rheology about these things, and then nonlinear rheology becomes very, very interesting, right? So you get very interesting nonlinear response, and this nonlinear response becomes much more prominent once when you get to the transition, right? The transition point. So there's a lot of work by Suzanne Fielding and her group in Durham, and in collaboration, as I said, with Max B. Again, quite a bit outside of my expertise, right? So what we've done, so why I like the Vertex models, because they allow us to do some interesting biology, right? So you can actually augment them, right? So you can have this basic framework, which I'm going to discuss in a second, of the mechanics, right? And then you can augment this adding activity, right? So there are multiple ways you can add activity. For example, what Max did and what we also did, where you essentially just assign the activity to the activity to the cell center. So you make something looks like cell-propelled particles, right? So you assign the director to the center of the cell, whatever that means, and you allow it to be noisily self-propelled, right? So these wiggles, and that's what we did together with Silke Henkes and a group of Martin Collins in Aberdeen. These are now the corneal epithelial cells, so the cells which are taken from the human cornea, and were grown on a substrate, and one can actually see using these type of models very nice scaling behavior, which then can be matched to the experiments. Then together with the group of K. Sveyer, my colleague in Dundee, we try to model the activity in junctions, which we believe is important for the chicken embryo problem, for the gastrulation in chicken embryo, where activity is now not kind of your standard cell propulsion activity, but it happens at the junctions, where the junctions can respond to the applied tensions and activate themselves. So you have some kind of active tension enhancement. And then also together with Julia and Jan, we've tried to look into how you can actually introduce a pneumatic type of activity for active pneumatics into these type of models. And what happens, and you get some very interesting physics, including the emergence of integer topological defects, which are normally not there in a pneumatic system, in a system with a pneumatic symmetry, because they break into halves. Yes, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm not very familiar with the Vertex model, but I understood that basically the only thing that are able to move are the vertices, right?
Yes.
So then you add the activity in the center. How does it?
Well, yeah. So that's a good question. Meaning, how do you do this technically, right? So we'll get to the technical part. So how do you do this technically? Well, you for example, you can do it democratically. You can say like this guy gets the average of these three. You can do it a little bit less democratically, where you normalize it by the area of the cell, meaning it's a game you can play, right? So the vertex model, vertex is always a degree of freedom, and you have a freedom of how you're going to translate that is happening at the cell and at the junction into something which is happening at the vertex, right?
Moving are always the
vertices are always moving. You know, everything else is kind of carried there, is there for a ride.
Yeah. So when you do this, you ensure that there is zero torque in the generated bits.
You have to make sure that there is zero. In practice, you don't really worry about this, because usually you never really get it to rotate, because it's all quite random. Right? Okay, good. So now we are getting more into the nitty-gritty details on how to do things. Right? As I said, cells are moving roughly at the microns a minute. Right? So they're very slow, extremely low Reynolds number. Right? So you can do Aristotelian physics, meaning that the force is proportional to the velocity, right? That's what we believe to be true for like 2,000 years, right? And then the Newton comes in, right? Okay, good. So you have some kind of a frictional force. As I said, what's going on the left is very interesting, but we don't have time to go into this. So a vertex, so this is the position of the vertex, dot means the time derivative, so the velocity of the vertex, times some kind of a friction constant gives you frictional force, and that is equal to the elastic forces, which are given by the gradient of the energy. So in these notes, which I apologize did not share with you, there is actually derivation of these things. It's lengthy and nasty, but it's doable, right? Plus some kind of active forces which you pull out of the hat, right? So essentially active forces is what you can impose on the system. And then what you want to do is you want to solve this equation, you want to iterate it over time. This is all highly nonlinear, so you have to use computers, right? You cannot really do much analytically. So the rest of the talk is how to do this, how to implement this, right? Okay. And the vertex and the energy which I'm going to be using is this form, simply to make things simpler, right? Because otherwise, extension to the general form is easy, but there are just more variables to deal with. And then the vertex model, the energy is given like this. The derivation, as I said, is given in the notes which I share. And then what all of these symbols mean is hopefully going to become clear as we progress through the actual implementation. Okay, so I'm only going to focus on the mechanics part. I'm going to forget this guy, right? And I'm going to solve this equation only. I'm going to show you how to do this. Unfortunately, in this game, We don't have anything like lamps or grommets, so I cannot really take the code off of the shelf. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build my own code. And I've shared this code with you, meaning a version of that code with you, a kind of simplified version. So I'm going to walk you through how one would do this. Right? So I'm moving to the third part. So I'm going to stop talking about physics at the moment and I'll go to computer science. This is where I invite a lot of questions about the technical details, right? So now it's going to become very technical, right? So very briefly, so I want to build a simulation tool. That's my goal. Right? And this is an interesting feat. It takes a while, but it's also, in my opinion, very rewarding because you kind of helps you understand also the problem you're working in. So in general, how does a simulation workflow look like? You have 4 main steps. The first one is initialization. You want to initialize your system. You want to say what is that you're simulating. And that can be anywhere from highly trivial. For example, if you're studying a bunch of Lennard-Jones particles, then all you need to do is you just need to generate a bunch of 3-dimensional coordinates and put them in some kind of simulation box, and you are done. You don't even have to worry about self-intersections that much. Okay? It can be very complex. If you're studying, if you want to study self-assembly of a virus, or if you want to study mechanics of a virus, then you need to build an initial configuration, which is highly non-trivial problem. Then the actual simulation, that's the actual workhorse of your program. Right? That's the code which actually takes this initial configuration and does something to it. And that's typically most consuming and most complex part of the problem. Once when you're done with the simulation, you need to do the data analysis and visualization. You need to present, you need to analyze the data which you produced. And that can also be computationally heavy. Nowadays, even that can be incredibly heavy. So that can also require substantial resources. And eventually you need to, you want to show it beyond the Christmas dinner table, right? I mean, you want to show this to the world. So you need to disseminate your results. And I'm showing it in gray because I'm not going to talk about dissemination. I'm mainly going to focus on the central part of the point number 2. Right? So what is my aim in here? My aim in here is to build a coherent software package that integrates all the steps of the simulation workflow. To kind of give you an outline, how would you build a software tool that does this? I want to have a relatively user-friendly, meaning from the physics audience. I'm not going to make it something that a grandma can use, sorry. Right? And I want to be relatively flexible, meaning if I want to play around, I want to be able to do this relatively simply, meaning I don't want to spend, if I want to have an idea, I want to test something, I don't want to spend 2 weeks coding just to make sure that my idea was nonsense. So I want to have something which works. I want to use abstraction as much as possible, right? So I want to separate physics from the nitty-gritty details of things like memory implementation and things like that. Right? I don't want to, if I want to add a term to the energy of my energy, right? I don't want to have to go there and remember what pointers are doing in memory, right? I want to do this as much as possible. And in this particular case, I want to be aware of the performance, but this is not completely critical for me, meaning I don't want to get every last CPU cycle out of all of what I'm doing. So I want to kind of strike a balance between the clarity and maintainability of the code and this actually being useful. That's my goal. So everything I'm going to show you is probably not the most optimal solution, but at least it's maintainable and extendable. Okay, good. So before we start, so I'm writing this in red because I learned it the hard way, right? It's very, very important not to make wrong decisions early on, right? Don't assume that you're going to know what you plan on doing 3 years down the road, right? So be very careful in making design choices, right? So get an idea of how different things are going to communicate. That's what I mean, a kind of a general overview. how are things gonna talk to each other? What needs to be coupled? What needs to be loosely coupled? Right? How is data going to be stored and curated? Right, that's very important. And how I'm going to achieve data provenance. Who is aware of data provenance? Is anybody aware of data provenance? What's data provenance? Data provenance is an incredibly important notion, which unfortunately in physics very often we neglect. So this is the lineage of the data. You need to know where the data comes from. Every step of from the creation of the data to the curation of data needs to be preserved, right? And that's incredibly important if you are working with, for example, patient data, right? With the data which is sensitive, right? Which is kind of, the disease data or some kind of biological data, right? You need to be able to kind of trace back to where the data originated. And that's, because without proper provenance, it's something very hard to actually determine where the data comes from and determine its authenticity. There are people who do their PhDs on data provenance and essentially building the workflow systems that keep track of how data is managed and maintained, right? In here, I'm just mentioning this because this is something which I think is going to become important in physics as we can generate more data, but not something which I'm going to be too much worried about at the moment. So pretty much the idea is when there is a graph in the paper, you should be able to click on the point and come back where exactly this data point is coming from, right? Things to consider, right, is how expensive is to create data. This is mainly important for archiving the data, right? So if it's going to take me 5 seconds to run the data and it's going to produce a gigabyte, then probably all I need to do is I just need to save a parameter file, and if I need to recreate the data, I'm just going to recreate it, right? If, for example, if it takes me 3 months to produce the data, then I better find a way to store this data permanently, right? Another early on decision which you need to make is how scalable I want this to be. So can I do it on a single core, multi-core? Do I want to go large scale? How do I fit in the existing software ecosystem, right? So if you are doing something, you want to visualize your data, you probably better produce files that can be read by the standard software for visualization. Right? You probably don't want to reinvent the wheel. Right? And I'm going to start with here the quote of Björn Strostrup. If you think it's simple, then you probably misunderstood the problem, right? And I think this is, I am deliberately cynical in here a little bit because a lot of physicists make this problem, right? It's kind of simple. I start coding, and then I end up with 15,000 lines of spaghetti code, which are called version 3B 15th of May, right? And you know what's going. So everybody knows who Björn Strostrup is. Nobody knows who Björn Strostrup is. The guy who went to C++, right? The C++ guy. Okay, good. Yes, okay, so a little bit of blah, blah. So essentially what this slide wants to tell you is, the choices which I'm going to make in here, right? So the first choice is initialization in this problem is relatively simple. It's not completely trivial, but it's relatively simple. All I need to do is I need to, and it has nothing to do with the rest of the code, so I'm going to fully decouple it. So I'm just going to have a bunch of Python scripts that are going to make my initial configurations, and then I'm going to use these initial configurations to do stuff with them. So it's going to be completely decoupled. I'm not too worried about performance because I'm going to work with systems that have a couple of thousand cells at most. So if it takes 10 minutes to build an initial configuration, so be it, right? I'm not going to spend too much time dealing with it, right? Then the simulation is going to be a completely separate code, which is going to read in the initial configuration that I'm going to save as a JSON. So this is JavaScript, no, what's JSON stands for? This is essentially a dictionary-like structure, which I can use to store the data, right? And it's read widely by a lot of libraries. Then the simulation code, I want it to be flexible and efficient. So the design choice which I'm making here, that I'm going to have a C++ backend, right, and a Python frontend, right? I want my user to be able to write Python code, but that this Python code is gonna, in the background, gonna call C++ libraries that are gonna do the heavy lifting, right? I cannot do everything in Python, it's too slow. I don't wanna do everything in C++ because I don't wanna lose my user base. And the data analysis and visualization. So data analysis is in this case not particularly heavy, so I'm again gonna use a Python, maybe NumPy, SciPy, to use it. And in terms of visualization, I'm not gonna write my own visualizer. There are fantastic software tools out there, so I'm gonna make my programs be able to produce the data that can be read with other packages, right? Okay, so I'm producing a moderate amount of data. We are maybe producing a gigabyte per run or so, less than a gigabyte, so that's reasonable, right? So I don't need to do anything fancy. I can zip the files when I'm done. I don't need to reinvent some kind of fancy file format, right? I'm gonna limit myself to 1,000 cells, so I can do this on a single CPU. I don't want to worry about the multi-core performance. I'm not gonna use any GUI, so that's why I'm saying it's gonna be user-friendly under quotes, right? So you're not gonna be any clicking. I'm gonna use on a POSIX system, so Linux or Mac OS. I don't know how to do it on Windows, unfortunately, right? And as I said, visualization will be left to people who know how to do it, not to me. Everybody knows who this is. That's Python guy, right? That's the guy who went Python. So that's why we like Python, because it's kind of very nice language. You can do a lot of things, right? Okay, good. So, any questions so far? So I am gonna briefly talk about how this particular package, which I showed on GitHub, is organized, right? So it's organized in this type of directory structure. This is probably the only thing which is strictly imposed by Python, because if I do it this way, then I can use automatic build tools which then I call through pip, so they can automatically install things and automatically compile and install things, which is very important, because if you get a new graduate student in your lab, you want to give them a code that can, or if you want somebody else to use your code, they want to be able to run this code immediately, right? Within 10 minutes, half an hour of getting the code, not spending 3 months and emailing you 300 times before they manage to compile it, right? So you need to kind of worry about how things are packaged, right? And how to install them. So that's very important, right? And that's why we try to do. And you also need to provide a bunch of examples so that people can actually hit the ground running, right? Okay, so what I want my simulation to be able to do, I want it to be able to do the vertex dynamics, to answer your question, to move the vertices, right? But I also want to be able to do the topological changes. I want to be able to implement these guys, right? So there are 3 typical cellular behaviors, what is called an intercalation, exchange of neighbors. So this is an a movie from the Chicambria, right? You see what happens. So cells are, let me play it again. Cells contract their edges, they exchange neighbors, right? So as if you're again in a crowded concert and you want to leave, your best chance of leaving is essentially swapping places with people, right? You just tap them on their shoulder and then you swap places. That's what cells do. Cells also ingress or get extruded. So this was an ingression. Cell shrunk and went down, right? And then cells also divide. So these are all things you want to be able to do, right? So cells divide. So these are these typical cellular behaviors, right? And you want to be able to implement them. So if you want your code to be of any use, you need to have all of these things. Okay? So how do we do this? So we are going to use a C++ backend. We are going to use a modular design. So this is something which I've learned a lot by looking into molecular dynamics codes and making mistakes. I want to separate things as much as possible. So I want to have modules that work independently. I don't want things to be too badly coupled, because if I screw something up somewhere, I don't want this to propagate throughout the entire code, right? So I want to be able to kind of make things maintainable by sandboxing things into logical entities, right? I'm going to find the balance between speed and flexibility, right? As I said, I want my code to be flexible, but I don't want to be completely flexible, right? I don't want to kind of, I'm going to make some assumptions, right? And I want to decouple as much of physics to low-level implementation. And this becomes important because if I want somebody else to work on my code, I want them to be able to relatively quickly be able to implement a new physics without, again, having to understand what is the memory management model which I use to do this. Right? And then something which I'm putting in bold in here, rely on libraries as much as possible, meaning there are very smart people out there who know what they're doing and they've made very good libraries. So use what other people have done. There is no shame in reusing other people's code, right? So this is really something which I always strongly encourage to be doing, right? Okay, so the system is going to have 5 components. They're going to be loosely coupled. They're going to be implemented the C++ classes, and they are the communication with them is going to be very limited. So there will be a mesh class which is going to be taking care of the actual configuration of the model of the tissue. Right, and 4 other classes that are going to be dealing with the physics of the system, and the last one, the 5th one, is going to be involved is going to be in charge for dumping the data for producing the results. Okay. As Nicholas Wirth, so again another very famous computer scientist, wrote a very famous book called Algorithms plus Data Structures equal Programs. Right. So we need to talk about data structures, how to implement this. Right. Okay. And this is the trickiest part. So how to implement the mesh, right? So how to implement the tissue. So you remember the tissue consists of, it's 2-dimensional system. It consists of vertices, edges, and faces. Faces are cells. So the natural structure is to use some kind of a meshing library. There are fantastic meshing libraries out there. 2 which I really like are OpenMesh, Grupinach in Germany, right? And Sigal, these are INRIA guys in Paris. Both are fantastically powerful, but not very useful for what we want to do because, in my opinion, a little bit over-engineered, right? So they're really good for computer graphics, but if you want to do it for what I want to do, not really that useful, mainly because if you're making computer graphics, you don't want cells to ingress and intercalate, right? So, and not very easy to implement these things. So what I decided to do instead, I decided to kind of step away from this, use other people's work, and to build my own library. So I'm gonna quickly walk you about how this is done. So what I do is I have a lightweight implementation of the mesh using so-called half-edge data structure. Okay, so what's a half-edge? So people who are familiar with C, this is the idea. The idea dates back to the Stone Ages of computing, right, 1978. It's a very elegant way of representing a mesh, right? It also works in 3 dimensions. So the central point is a half edge, right? So why it's called a half edge? Well, because edge on a graph, you need to make it directed. You need to, because mesh connects vertices I and j, right? So I and j, but I don't know in which way I go, right? So I can either specify for each edge the connectivity, or what I can do is I can horizontally split my edge into 2 half edges which are directed, right? So one going this way and the one going the other way. I kind of double the data, but I solved the problem of orientation, and that's the central point of the data structure. So each vertex is going to have a pointer. It's going to know one of its half edges. Doesn't mean which one, doesn't matter which one of which it points to, one of which it originates from it. For example, this blue guy. Each face is going to know one of its half edges, right? So they all circle around. And then half edge is the central part of this data structure. So each half edge is going to know which vertexes come from, right? Which vertexes comes from, which vertex is pointing to, right? Which face it belongs to, and what its next and the previous guy are, and what its pair is. And now you can already see that this is really beautiful, because now you can do any type of walks through this type of network, relatively easily, right? You start from a vertex, you go next, and you're here, right? You start from a vertex, you do pair next, and you're here, and so on and so on. So you can actually very elegantly traverse this edge. What is annoying in here is you have these stars, which are pointers, which means you have to deal with the memory. Okay, good. So as I said, it becomes very easy to do typical operations on the mesh, which is circulating around for example, a face if you want to calculate the area, or circulating around the vertex if you want to calculate the force on the vertex, and so on and so on. So it's a very elegant data structures. It's easy to navigate, as I said. It's also relatively easy to add new elements. So if you want to split the vertex, if you want to add another vertex, that's actually very cheap. And it's also robust. So if you don't set it up properly, it crashes, right? So meaning it's if it works, you're very likely correct, right? It also has its cons. It's not easy to implement because all of this memory management is highly non-trivial. It's very hard to parallelize, although now we have some ideas how to do this and actually have some implementation. It's also not cache friendly, right? So you are not going to take much advantage of cache if you have a bigger system, which is really can be a drawback, right? But you can go around these problems. Right? Okay, so how I'm going to implement this? So I'm going to use a standard library, right? And why I'm going to use the standard library? Because exactly very smart people have done this memory management for you. So I want to avoid all sorts of memory management issues. And instead of row pointers, I'm going to use iterators, which gives you some kind of a little bit of overhead. But in modern implementation, this is really negligible compared to what you gain. Right? So what is an iterator? Iterator is, think of it as a pointer. So if you have an array, a sequence of data, then an iterator is going to tell you where you are in this sequence. It's going to tell you how you iterate over a sequence. So how do you implement? This means there are many ways to do this. So each of these pointers are going to be handled as iterators. So I'm going to have a handle which is a pointer to the half edge. I'm going to have a pointer to the vertex and to edge and to the face. Right? And then I am going to store the data as numbers, right, which are the IDs of different elements. That are going to be stored in vectors that are sitting in the mesh class, right? So that's the idea. So the half edge is going to tell you who is connected to whom, and actual data is going to stored in the mesh class. And if those of you who are familiar with meta programming, I'm also going to use templating to template out the properties of the system, because things like the native areas, line tensions, and things like that. They are completely decoupled from the connectivity of the network, so they live in a separate space. Right? So how do I implement this very quickly? Right. So the class vertex is going to be. I'm going to have a bunch of classes that are templated using the property, which is going to contain the things that I want to assign to the vertex. Right? And I'm going to be able to assign this property using the data structure, which returns in here the reference, so I can overwrite my property. So if I want to, for example, move the vertex, I can do this over there. Right? And then I'm also going to have a function which is going to return me a half edge to each point, so which allows me to actually move along my mesh. And a similar implementation for the face. Again, I'm not expecting you to follow this in gore details at this stage. The code is well documented and it's sitting on the GitHub. And then finally, how do I put all of this together? Well, I put all of this together. I apologize for this very faint color. Is by putting everything inside the vectors. Right? So vector is a kind of older brother of an array. It's a memory contingent structure. Which is going to contain all of these objects, and then these three classes, vertices, edges, vertices, half edges, and faces, are going to essentially tell you how these things are connected to each other, allowing you to very quickly go around. So why am I using vectors? Well, because they have a fast random access, and it's memory coalescence, so this helps me a little bit with cache. However, I have to be careful. that this approach is not really very good if I want to add things to my network, because then I have to recreate all of my iterators, but that's technical thing. So in actual production version of this code, I'm using lists, which are a little bit slower, but a little bit more flexible. Okay, any questions so far about design? Okay, and finally, as I said, I am abstracting away all my properties as a separate class, pretty much a trait class, right? Where I can now store all the information, for example, like the preferred native area of a cell, or the cell velocity, or the tension junction, and so on, in this type of property class, right? So as I said, why I do this? Because my original design is to abstract away as much as possible, to decouple as much as possible. So if I come in, and if I want to add color of a cell for whatever reason, right, I just need to add one line in here, right? I don't need to touch anything else in the other data structures of the of my mesh. So I'm reducing the amount of possibilities of making producing a bug in the code. And if I do produce a bug in the code, I know exactly where to look for it, because I know where it can be and where it cannot be. So that's the idea. The penalty that you pay, you just have to do templating, which is not trivial, and it adds a little bit of compilation time, but not a big deal. Right? And then, as I said, I want to decouple the implementation as much as possible from understanding how the data structure works inside, meaning so leave it to the designer, right? So this would be a piece of code that actually traverses over which calculates the coordination of a vertex. So how do I calculate the coordination of a vertex? I start from a vertex, I find its neighbor, right? And then I increment, set I equal to 0. So then I start from this guy, I find its neighbor, then I add 1. Then I take a pair next to, pair next 3, pair next time where I started, then I'm done, right? So this is this piece of code, right? But that's bloody confusing, especially if you are new to the whole building, because what the hell are these H's in first, and then why am I doing all of this? So it's much better to do something like this, right? So you abstract things away, right? So I use the machinery of C++ to actually calculate something, create something which is called a circulator, creates an object which is going to automatically circulate around my vertex. And then I can put everything in a for loop, which pretty much everybody is familiar with. And then this becomes much more intuitive. So I say, like, for all the half edges which are circulating around a vertex, I increment the pointer by 1. Now, unfortunately, C++ comes with a lot of things, but not with the circulator, so you have to implement it. So implementing circulators is highly non-trivial. And this is where ChatGPT was incredibly useful, right? So meaning it didn't produce a good code, but it gave me good ideas to know where to go, right? To gave me a good structure. So to do this, and this is one of those things. Circulators are one of those things where you spend one afternoon pulling your hair, and then you implement it, then you forget, then you kind of very nicely use it. So there is no shame in using tools such as ChatGPT. Also, the GitHub Copilot is incredibly valuable in doing things like this, right? Because a lot of people have done a lot of very good code, and there's no shame in stealing other people's design ideas, right? So you can actually implement them. As I said, it's highly non-trivial. If you want to understand how it works, we can talk about this, and you can also check the code, which is available online. Right? Okay, so now we're getting back to physics. Now that we have all the ingredients in place, remember I showed this formula. So I actually want to calculate the force on each vertex. And then I said I'm going to explain what these symbols in here mean. So if I want to calculate a force on a vertex, R, I need to put a minus in here, right? So I take the cell, all the cells that are, this means all the cells that are shared by this vertex, right? So I go over 3 or 4 cells that are shared by this vertex. And then I calculate the distance between the lengths of the 2 edges that are connected to that vertex in that particular cell. So this is going to give me the area term. That's the derivation is in the nodes. And then for the perimeter term is a very similar thing where I do the one before and one after, right? So one can actually, with a little bit of playing, one can actually show that this can be rearranged by always matching for each edge, for each vertex and its neighbor. I can always do this in terms of the pairs of cells. So I can always do it this way, right? Which means now that all I need to do is I need to make a circulator in my language, which is going to circulate around each vertex, and then use pairs of cells to calculate the force which is coming from this edge in here. Right? And I add them up and I get the cell at the vertex. Now, of course, you're going to tell me that this is not very efficient, and I agree that's not very efficient because I could use third Newton's law. Right? Because if I calculated the force on this vertex due to this edge, that's exactly minus the force on this vertex due to this edge. Right? Now, I'm not doing this deliberately because implementing it would not be trivial. So I sort of double the effort of calculating the force, which you might argue is a not very good design decision because the force is calculating in every time step, right? So this is a very time-consuming thing. But as you'll see, the code is relatively simple. So the overhead which I pay, I'm willingly paying. I'm aware that I'm paying this overhead. And I'm doing it at the expense of being able to be very modular and very clear, right? But as I said, one could do a slightly more intelligent design to do this, and that we are getting back to the one of the red, which I think wrote in the back. Think about the design not very early, right? Because this is a decision which you should make very early, whether you're going to use the third Newton law or not. Yep.
Use Newton's third law, right? Because you don't have really canceling force pairs.
I wrote it. I mean, here I wrote it as a meaning. You can, in this particular case, you write it as really as a thing which is coming.
You can. Okay, you can. Okay, so you could do it.
You could do it, right? But the problem is then very quickly you're going to come up with something which you cannot. And then if you early on implement the third Newton law, right, you get up in the situation where you might kind of, put yourself for making early design choice. A good example is OMD Blue, which is this fabulously good package for molecular dynamics, which probably quite a few of you are familiar with. So Josh Anderson, when he designed it originally, it was designed for molecular dynamics back in 2006 or so. That was roughly the time. And then what you do, you implement the third Newton law very deeply inside of your code, because why on earth would you not have a third Newton law implemented, right? And then fast forward to 2019, 2020, and people start talking about non-reciprocal interactions. And then the mailing list of OMD start getting like, yeah, but I need my A to talk differently to my B, right? My AB should be different than my BA, right? And then you realize that if you want to do this, you need to go into the very, very deep bowels of OMD Blue to change this, right? So that's why I said in here, sometimes performance might be the most critical thing if you want to have a design, if you want something which is flexible enough, okay? And then I can calculate force like this, which is really fabulous, right? So I'm just gonna iterate and I'm gonna compute the force, and then this guy is gonna be my workhorse. So my workhorse is now gonna have two contributions, right? So it's gonna calculate the force of per area and force per perimeter, so I can use them as Lego blocks. But in order to achieve this, I need to use something which is called a class factory, right? Yuan already has a facial expression. What is he talking about? So computer scientists, some people claim that this is the Bible. Some people claim that this is the worst thing ever written. So this is what is called, what is in a computer science community known as the Gang of Four. This is a book of design patterns, right? 24 design patterns that kind of prevail through the software design. Some people say that this completely set back the computer science for decades. I'm not going to go into this discussion. It's not my domain. But if you open this book tells you how certain systems are built. And one of them is a template called the class class factory. So class factory is a fancy name for a class which gives birth to other classes, right? You can call it the mother class, right? So the class in which I can now pass a few arguments, and it's going to produce me the children of different types. So why would I need in here a class factory? Because what I want to achieve is something like this, right? So I want to be able in my script to say I want to run simulation where I'm going to add area and perimeter, and maybe 2 days from now something else, self-propulsion. And then I'm sick and tired of self-propulsion, and I'm going to do area and junction tension, right? So I want to be able to do this as Lego. So I don't want to have to modify my code. I want to be able to tell to my code, add, remove stuff. And this code in here, which calculates the force, is going to automatically go around and pick the class that I gave it, right? So it's automatically going to walk over the actually this code you want, but there is a code which does that, right? There is a code which does that, right? Which is going to walk over all these things which I enabled, right? And calculate, add them up to the force. And that gives me a very flexible system, which then allows my user to kind of, you get master student, you get honor student, you just tell them like, try this, try that, and they can very quickly comment out or add new lines in their script. Okay, good. And then once when I have something like this, then I can really abstract away the entire calculation of each of these elements into a couple of lines of code. And I think this is where I find this approach quite appealing, because I can actually physics, I can then abstract away into very narrow pieces, very short pieces of code that I can then, that are easy to debug, right? This is easier to bug than I had like 300 lines of spaghetti code embedded in a bunch of for loops, okay? So very quickly about the topology changes, that's actually the trickiest part. I'm only gonna talk about the T1 transition, which is the exchange of neighbors, and I am gonna implement it in here as I'm gonna monitor the length of the junction. If the junction goes beyond a certain length, then I'm gonna flip it, and how I'm gonna flip it is I'm just gonna rotate it counterclockwise by 90 degrees, and I'm gonna make it slightly longer. So I'm gonna go from this configuration to this configuration shown in gray, and you can convince yourself that this is what you need to do. So all you need to do is locally you need to do a little bit of shuffling of the edges. Let's click about this. This is entire code, which I'm not gonna, of course, gonna go over, but again, not too complicated, abstracted away, bug prone, of course, but easy to debug because everything is within one function, so you can actually relatively easily find where the problem might be. Okay.
So I have two questions. The first question is how, what is the effect of selecting the different threshold in this flipping? So if you change it by, I don't know, 10, 20%, then the outcome of the simulation.
That's an excellent question, right? And this is again something which needs to be explored very carefully, because there are other ways. Meaning what I skipped in here, there is this other approach where you collapse the vertex, right? And then you calculate the forces onto the vertex and see if it wants to split or not. This comes from David Bansky's group, right? Which is much more physical. So and this is just a statement of empirical observation, is that qualitatively you get the same results, but quantitatively where things start happening becomes tricky. And well, I'm not going to say this, but there might the issue discrepancy between 3.81 and might have to do with this. Maybe, I'm not sure.
And the second question is, can you do fancy things like, for instance, limit the rate at which a junction zips and unzips to simulate realistic binding and unbinding events, if I remember? So, in other words, how easy would it be to implement it in your code?
Offhand, I would say should be straight. I need to understand exactly what you have in mind, right? But nominally, it shouldn't be too complicated, right? because you have the data structure, right? And then you just glue things to the way how it's designed is that you can glue things what you need, right? Now if it is something which where you have to kind of have a memory of the state of the junction, we would have to talk about this, meaning about the details, right? But in principle, why not, right? Meaning I don't see any kind of offhand reason why it would be hard. Yep.
To allow for basically vertices to collapse into one single vertex. How do you deal actually with that in the code? I mean, if we write down the equation of the code, we basically iterate over each vertex. And this number of vertices is not like saved or not constant. How do we implement the, let's say, movement of the whole stuff?
Let's talk about it afterwards. Meaning, you just label it as an array, then you ignore it. That's how I do it, right? So you just meaning we can talk about this. Meaning you can remove it, but then you have a memory management issue, right? Or you can just label it as erased, and then in your integrator you ignore it. That's how it's technically implemented, right? Because it's not part of the mesh anymore. It's completely straightforward. Okay, so let's briefly talk about. So the initial configuration is gonna look something like this. So this is a JSON file. So I'm just gonna give you a bunch of records which tell you about where things live, right? So I'm gonna include the things like simulation box, how big it is, whether I have periodic boundary conditions, don't have a periodic boundary conditions, and then I'm gonna include information about the faces as cells, as their reference area, whether they're passive active, and then which vertices belong to them. And then I can use very powerful libraries that are coming with C++ that actually read the JSON files automatically. That's why I have chosen JSON, because other people use JSON a lot. So I can actually read this very elegantly and make it very flexible. Right? And then finally, there was a lot of C++ mumbo jumbo, so I don't want to lose the audience. So what I want to do is want to expose all of this to Python, right? So I want to be able to my user to use a Python interface to access these data structures, right? Which are living in C++. And then PyBind11 is your best friend to do this. That's this guy, I cannot remember his name. He is a professor in ETH. This is all based on what is called Boost Python. So Boost library used to have a Python interface, which was a nightmare as everything in Boost. But then he rewrote it using C++11 is just a masterpiece, meaning this is one of the pinnacles of, guy could have made millions out of this, but he made it publicly available, which is, hats off, right? Okay, so you can actually use C++ mumbo jumbo like this, and then you can expose your C++ to Python, right? And now it becomes open to use. So what you do is now, you write codes like this, right? So this is your simulation code. So you write Python code where you do a little bit of mumbo jumbo, where you kind of set up the simulation, and then from there on you specify the parameters through Python dictionary, and then you run the simulation. Right? So as a user, you only see this. You only want to see the C++ part if you want to change it, if you want to add stuff. So as a user, you only see this. Now, normally this code will be cleaner, but I condense it so I can put it in the on the single frame. Now I'm going to go back to tell you a little bit about, because what I need in here is I need to read the input configuration, right? And that input configuration needs to be made. And this is, as I said, done with Python. So these are set of standalone scripts that actually build your initial configuration, and are going to produce you JSON files, which you can use then to simulate the system. The code, as it's written, allows both for periodic boundary conditions and open boundary conditions. If you have open boundary conditions, then you have a question, what are you going to do at the boundaries? Right? And there are many ways. There are several ways to handle this. The approach which I've chosen is so-called using the outer face, which is a ghost face. So the entire system actually has a topology of a sphere, right? So there is the outside is surrounded by a sphere which has a negative area because you traverse it in the clockwise direction along these blue guys. And then you're completely oblivious whether you're in a periodic boundary or not. Right? So then you can deal with both situations equally. Right? And then when you have this, then you set up a simulation like this, and you can play with the parameters. And as I said, the beauty of using class factories as the machinery to create or remove elements is in here. So if I want to study simulation of a foam, for example, if I want to only study area, all I need to do is comment out this line, and the code is automatically going to take care of this. If I, for example, want to add cell propulsion, I'm going to say in here forces add cell propulsion, and this is going to add cell propulsion to the system. Right? So it gives me quite a bit of flexibility to do things. Right? And then I'm going to producing the outputs that can be VTP files. That's something which I can visualize in ParaView, for example, or in Ovito, and the JSON file, which gives me data that I can then post-process, for example, in Python, right? So the basic analysis can be done in the same script where you run the simulation, right? So you can calculate things like areas and stuff like that. If you want to do something more sophisticated, for example, if you want to calculate the tensors that characterize the mesh, right? So for example, the texture tensors and so on, then usually how I do this is I save the data files, JSON files, and then I read them in Python and process them in Python. If you want something more complicated, you would probably need to develop a more sophisticated code. But again, that's should be straightforward once when you have the data, right? Which is beyond this tutorial. And then, as I said, visualization, I've tried once in my life when I was younger, when all of you are obsessed. In one point in time, most of us are obsessed with graphics. I gave up very quickly on trying to write my own visualization software. So nowadays, I use predominantly ParaView, which is freely available, and PyVista, which is really a powerful Python library, which allows you to do three-dimensional visualization directly, for example, in Jupyter notebooks. But it's missing 3 dimensions, everything which I told you 3 dimensions, right? But this is 2-dimensional, so you can actually extend this to 3 dimensions. The data structure works perfectly in 3 dimensions. I mentioned it a little bit on Friday when I talk about membranes, but it's involved. Right? Proper documentation, right? So what you want usually some kind of Doxygen or something even more sophisticated nowadays to automatically generate your documentation. So you can get a website which is automatically generated with your code. Also, what I'm not doing in here, I'm not doing the data provenance properly. So what you would want for your code is to automatically make you, let's say, JSON files or some kind of metadata files where you can just take this file and say, this was created on this date with exactly these parameters, even what is the version of the code, or even what is the version of the GitHub, what is the tag of the compilation tag of the code. So you can actually fully track back where the data is coming from. That's missing. That's not too hard to implement, but it's a lot of spaghetti code to do this, right? And what would be very nice to do would be nice to have some kind of GUI, preferably in the web, as a web interface. WebAssembly is incredibly appealing, right? So where you would have a backend which is compiled to WebAssembly and doing the visualization, doing the actually workforce and then JavaScript on the top. But for me, this is all a pipe dream. I'm really not a JavaScript expert, and I don't really know much about WebAssembly. I've seen that the community who is working with particle simulations in the context of the material science, they actually have some really good tools like that. So if anybody's interested in doing something like this, I'm more than open, right? And the code is available online, right? It's called VM tutorial. As I said, this is a stripped down version of the production codes that I'm using. And if I'm to summarize, right? So I think what is the take home message in here is, and this is based on my own experience, modular design, try to abstract away as much as possible. Separate components should do their own work, and they just communicate, so kind of minimizing the overlap between the components. Try to separate the nitty-gritty details of the technical computer science implementation physics as much as possible, right? Leave things like memory management to people who are paid to do this, right? So things like standard libraries. And as I said, separate things as much as possible because that makes maintenance and debugging much easier. And thank you for your attention.